Welcome. This is the DeLongTODAY briefing. I am Brad DeLong, an economics professor here at the University of California at Berkeley and a sometime Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. This is the weekly DeLongTODAY briefing. Here I hold forth on the Lee Bureau's Vimeo platform on my guesses as to what I think you most need to know about what our economy is doing to us right now. I promised Wes Neff, when he agreed to provide the infrastructure for this, that I and my briefings would be lively, interesting, curious, thoughtful, and relatively brief. Relatively. I promised I'd provide briefings on a mix of forecasting, politics, macroeconomic analysis, history, and political economy. Today is a political economy briefing. But first, Friday morning saw a very good employment report indeed. 6 more months of this, and I will start to think that maybe Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard have a point with their fears that perhaps Biden's $1.9 trillion rescue plan was a bit too large to be optimal. The United States labor market added 916,000 jobs, seasonally adjusted, comparing March to February. The prime-age employment-to-population rate increased by 0.3 percentage points and is now back to where it was in 2014, halfway through the anemic post-2009 recovery. Inadequate, but no longer totally disastrous. Employment growth in March was led by leisure and hospitality and education services, as in-person activity was able to resume, alongside a notable increase in construction. Notable. Wages fell, but wages falling is a good sign. It means that low-wage employment is coming back as herd immunity approaches. Perhaps, if anything, employment is coming back too fast. Reopened prematurely, and we could have another excessive and avoidable 100,000 deaths from the COVID-19 plague. Now, it had been a Latin session to a remarkable degree. Latin unemployment rose by 15 percentage points, while white unemployment rose by 11 percentage points at the nadir. But now Latin employment is close to back to having its, quote, normal elevation over white. That is, things are no longer significantly worse in relative terms than they are usually, as far as the ethnic skew of unemployment goes. As I said, 6 more months of employment reports like this, and I really will start to think that maybe Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard have a point with their fears that perhaps Biden's $1.9 trillion rescue plan was a bit too large to be optimal. But the $1.9 trillion rescue plan is now law, and now the Biden administration has moved on to jobs, the American Jobs Plan. It is infrastructure and corporate taxes, what I call rebuild after rescue, in an attempt to find some alliteration here. What does this part of Biden's plan hope to do? Let me focus first on the corporate tax part, which is really an international corporate tax part, since that is the area on which my views are best developed. Biden calls it the Made in America tax plan. And yes, as a card-carrying neoliberal globalist, the Made in America part makes me wince. Economic nationalism, in my experience, turns what ought to be a win-win countries cooperate discussion frame into a win-lose countries struggle for position discussion frame, which winds up with lose-lose policies. Yet when I look at the substance of Biden's plan, it looks good. The Biden administration says the president is proposing to fix the corporate tax code so it incentivizes job creation and investment here in the United States. I would say, with perhaps more truth, that, quote, the president is proposing to fix the corporate tax code to remove provisions that destructively and improperly incentivize job creation and investment outside the United States. Because that is what it does. And I have no quarrel whatsoever with the other two objectives as they are stated. stops unfair and wasteful profit shifting to tax havens, ensures that corporations are paying their full share. Why is Obama doing this? No, not Obama. Why is Biden doing this? Let me back up. Let me back up to 2017. The 2017 Ryan McConnell-Trump Corporate Tax Act reduced the average rate that corporations paid in half to less than 10% in 2018. And it also created remarkably powerful and stupid new incentives to shift profits and jobs overseas. The economist shilling for it when it passed, they claimed it would ignite another boom like the 1990s, generate as large a shift in American spending away from current consumption and toward investment for the future, as we saw had been unleashed by and came in the wake of the Clinton 1993 Fiscal Rebalancing Reconciliation Bill. It did not deliver. To first order, it had zero effect on investment in America. Before the COVID-19 plague hit, the share of national income devoted to investment had already begun to fall. To the extent that companies subject to American taxes responded to Ryan McConnell-Trump by increasing investment, they did so overseas. At home, they did share buybacks and acquisitions. They did those nearly exclusively. Now, to produce a corporate tax cut that does not boost firms' incentives to increase investment at home at all, that is a truly remarkable thing to accomplish, a rare demonstration of total incompetence or total corruption in the details of legislation design. And yet the Republican shill economists, from George Shultz to John Taylor, from Mike Boskin to Kevin Hassett, from Casey Mulligan and Jagdish Bhagwati to John Cochran and Douglas Holtz-Eakin, they all trumpeted that the bill would boost investment in America and economic growth for enough for the tax cut to pay for itself, or nearly. An extra 0.4 percentage points of GDP growth per year, and not a higher but a lower federal debt in relation to the size of GDP. And others who were not willing to go that far, the Robert Barrows and the Greg Mankiws, were still enthusiastic cheerleaders for how it would raise growth and raise after-tax wages because the growth effects would outweigh the adverse distribution effects. Of course, none of this happened. None of this was ever going to happen. As my colleague Alan Auerbach said, the thing had to be moved through fast. The thing had to be given the bum's rush. Or else, as people took another look at it, they would say, hey, wait a minute, and the support for it would dissolve. So, catastrophic failure of Ryan McConnell-Trump significantly added to the inequality in our country in income and wealth, and getting absolutely nothing in return for it. And now Joe Biden and his administration are trying to fix it. And they are trying to fix it in a smart way, not to roll things back to how they were in 2016. To make important tweaks to significantly improve the workings of the corporate tax code and system, especially as it interacts with the international sector. Biden wants to, 1, set the corporate tax rate at a moderate 28%, 2, impose a country-by-country minimum tax on U.S. corporations at 21% in capture profits in tax havens, 3, eliminate allowances of zero taxes on the first 10% of return for investments in foreign countries, and 4, most important, in fact the key part of Biden's proposal, in fact I think more important than everything else, international tax harmonization. Cooperate with German and Japanese and other proposals that have already been made for international negotiations to produce something like minimum corporate tax harmonization. And if a country is an international scofflaw, if it refuses to play by the new multilateral rules of the game that the Biden administration hopes it can achieve agreement on, then any payments to corporations headquartered in such tax haven countries will be denied deduction. They will be deemed as profits and taxed, as profits. And, of course, Biden wants to fund the corporate tax division of the IRS at a level so that it can actually do its job. Will all of this work? I think this will all work if the Biden administration is, in fact, able to actually find the Holy Grail in this issue area. If it is able to achieve multilateral international minimum tax harmonization. The stars do appear to be aligned. The other major industrial powers, Germany, Japan, etc., are tired of being played for saps. Tax haven countries, Ireland, Luxembourg, etc., have no bargaining power, and they depend on complaisant U.S. and other legislators blocking legal provisions to enable enforcement. There are loose cannons on the deck. Boris Johnson's Britain, the ability of tax haven countries and plutocrats who benefit from them to block the international negotiation process through interference from domestic legislators. We will see how it will work. But this time, the stars do appear aligned. This time, Democratic legislators appear to really understand that their long-term ability to govern depends on Biden enacting good policies, on those good policies being actually well implemented, on them thereafter actually working, and that they be seen to have contributed, that they be seen to have supported Biden. And the problem is that Biden needs them all, needs all of the Democrats. If any of them decide that they would rather satisfy plutocrat or tax haven lobbyists at the expense of good policy, and at the cost of doing significant damage to the Democratic Party's reputation as an effective party for responsible governance. If any of them do that, then the Made for America Tax Act fails. Then it fails unless there are Republican legislators more interested in good policy and in reducing the deficit than in confronting with Biden with a united anti-every-tax Republican Party. I look at today's Republican Party, and I think that as for getting those Republican votes, good luck. Going outside of my wheelhouse, in my view, the best way to get Republican votes is not to need them, to have a clear road to enactment that does not require them. Recall Senator Harry Reid's description of Senator Susan Collins, always there for a vote when you do not need hers. So the stars on the Made in America Tax Act are aligned, but not very aligned. It would be a very good thing for America and for the world if it were to pass. I put its chances at no more than 50%. Now let me turn to the infrastructure part. On his Substack weblog Friday morning, Matthew Iglesias, the very sharp Matthew Iglesias, wrote that, quote, I would have quietly sent an emissary to Roger Wicker and Sam Graves, the ranking Republican members on the Senate and House Transportation Committees, and told them that Biden is really eager to get a bipartisan infrastructure bill done. He has a few specific priorities related to clean electricity and clean water he'd like to get in there. But since a bipartisan infrastructure bill is a win for Biden, if he wants that win, he needs to defer to Republicans on the substance. Biden's, quote, raise taxes on the rich via their ownership of corporations to fund infrastructure spending, unquote, means your infrastructure bill has to be highly partisan. And I think a highly partisan infrastructure bill is tough. And I think Matt Iglesias is not living in the world we live in. In fact, Matt Iglesias is not living in the world we've been living in for the past 15 years. Consider that Matt Iglesias's alternative, cede control over substance to moderate Republicans. That is the strategy that Obama pursued for Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Since a bipartisan universal health care bill was a big win for Obama, he decided he needed to give a lot of ground on the substance. And so after he had thrown the Democratic public option over the side, he wound up enacting nationwide Romney Care. And yet he wound up enacting nationwide Romney Care with 100% Democratic votes. And then partisan Republicans on the Supreme Court and in the Congress kneecapped it. And they were only kept from killing it when they realized that it had already been placed long enough that they would then own the destructive substantive policy fallout. Now, what is different now than there was in 2009, 2010? What is different now than there was in 2009 and 2010 to make the Matthew Iglesias strategy work for infrastructure now, when it did not work for healthcare then? Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Now you can make the argument that this time things are different. After all, also Friday morning, former Speaker of the House John Boehner, Republican from Ohio, wrote, quote, "I also had not anticipated the extent to which this new crowd hated, and I mean hated, Barack Obama. When I was first elected to Congress, there was no Drudge Report, no Breitbart, no kooks on YouTube spreading dangerous nonsense like they did every day about Obama. He's a secret Muslim, he hates America, he's a communist, and of course the truly nutty business about his birth certificate. People really had been brainwashed into believing Barack Obama was some Manchurian candidate planning to betray America. Mark Levin was the first to go on radio and spout off this crazy nonsense. It got him ratings. So eventually he dragged Hannity and Rush to Looneyville along with him. My longtime friend Roger Ailes, the head of Fox News, was not immune. He got swept up into the conspiracies and the paranoia and became an almost unrecognizable figure. Rupert Murdoch, cared about ratings and the bottom line, wanted to make sure he was ahead of any political or policy developments. If he entertained any of the kooky conspiracy theories taking over his network, he kept it a secret from me, but he clearly didn't have a problem with them if they helped rating. Now, of course, Boehner wants to say both sides. Quote, Obama didn't help himself much either. He could come off as lecturing and haughty. He still wasn't making Republican outreach a priority. But Boehner can't maintain both sides. After all, Obama outreached to Boehner just fine and made that a fine high priority, as Boehner admits. On the other hand, how do you find common cause with people who think you are a secret Kenyan Muslim traitor to America? Are things different now than they were then? What Boehner doesn't talk about so much is that Obama is a black man, and that what triggered a great deal of the Republican legislators and the Republican base was that he had put themselves in a superior position relative to them by becoming president, and they really could not stand that. So the sotto voce argument that has to underlie the belief that Biden will do better than Obama is that this time things are different because Joe Biden is a white man and not a black man, and that Obama's failure to elicit Republican cooperation was overwhelmingly because Republicans are racist adjacent. And there are lots of arguments against that. They are A, it needs to be overwhelmingly and not substantially, because Obama was a black man. Just substantially, that won't get Biden much credit. B, ceding substantive policy ground to the Republicans is, given their current state, making bad, destructive policies. And C, that Fox News is right now working as hard as possible to Obama-ize Biden. Look at its front page as of this taping. Hunter Biden. Democrats trying to steal elections. Crisis at the border. Democrats surrendering to Iranian Muslim terrorists. Pope Francis celebrates Good Friday. Tucker Carlson says that tobacco is an effective anti-obesity medication. And below the fold, Sean Hannity claiming that Joe Biden is, quote, waging all-out assault on American principles. As Boehner says of the Republican members of Congress who entered in the 2010s and who are now the entirety of the Republican Congressional Caucus, incrementalism, cooperation, compromise, that wasn't their thing. A lot of them wanted to blow up Washington. That's why they thought they were elected. Some of them, well, you could tell they weren't paying attention because they were just thinking of how to fundraise off of outrage or how they could get on Hannity that night. They didn't want legislative victories. They wanted wedge issues and conspiracies and crusades. A power base thanks to fawning right-wing media and outrage-driven fundraising cash, and a new head lunatic. And here it is where Boehner picks out the person who he loathes most in the current Republican Legislative Caucus. There is nothing more dangerous than a reckless asshole who thinks he's smarter than everyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Senator Ted Cruz. Now, without a very different set of Republican legislators in Congress, ones who work for constituents rather than for Fox News and for their masters in the fundraising firms. No, things have to be done by the Democratic caucus via reconciliation, or under threat of reconciliation, or under threat of doing it via the Democratic caucus alone. There is space for bipartisan cooperation, but only if it is clear that if worst comes to worst, the Democrats can do it through their caucus alone, their way. So what is the problem that Infrastructure Week wants to solve? It is this one, the left graph on this slide. Public investment in America as a share of national income. With the end of the space race to the moon, and the end of the massive spurt of construction of the interstate highway system, plus a few other factors, U.S. government investment in America fell from its Eisenhower-Kennedy-Johnson norm of 6.5% of national income down to 4.75% of national income, where it remained until the early 1990s. Then Clintonian austerity. The belief in the early 1990s that the U.S. was approaching the edge of its debt capacity and needed to stop borrowing soon. Austerity produced by that pushed U.S. government, all levels, investment spending down to 4% of national income. Now, back in 1993, I would have told you that this austerity was certainly the right thing to do. Now I will only say it was probably the right thing to do for the time. And then after 2010, Obama's searching for a grand bargain on entitlements with the Republicans opened the way to a further downward salami slice of public investment in America, down to only 3.5% of national income, solidified by Obama's decision not to fully roll back the Bush 2001 tax cuts. And this 50-year policy move away from investment in America by the government, it really has been a horrible mistake. Now, this mistake was mitigated by the fact that, for the most part, for most years, private investment in America has remained healthy. Yes, the Reagan deficit switched savings from funding investment in America to buying government bonds and so put substantial downward pressure on private investment. But Clinton reversed that and boosted private investment spending by 5 percentage points of national income or so back to healthy levels. But unfortunately, the failure to prioritize full employment generated from the anemic recovery from the Great Recession, which has left the private nominal investment share of national income once again well short of historical norms, and of course the Ryan McConnell-Trump tax cut was designed not to boost investment in America, but instead simply to channel money to plutocrats. And if we are continuing to invest at even a semi-healthy rate here in America, it's not because of the flow of spending into investment, but because of reduced prices of products in the investment goods sector. Now, Biden wants to boost investment in America by the government back not to its 1950s and 1960s share, but at least to its 1970s and 1980s share. If you read the Biden kind of American Jobs Act documents, you see that while Biden says, quote, that public domestic investment as a share of the economy has fallen by more than 40% since the 1960s, it's true. He does not promise to boost it all the way back. All he says is that, quote, the American Jobs Act plan will invest in America in a way we have not invested since we built the interstate highways and won the space race to the moon. Note the since. He says not invest in America as, but invest in America since. Not a big enough step, therefore, is what I say. Nevertheless, this does strike me as a highly good step. Fix highways, rebuild bridges, upgrade ports, airports, and transport systems, deliver clean drinking water, renew the electrical grid, high-speed broadband to all Americans, build, preserve, and retrofit more than 2 million commercial buildings and homes, modernize our nation's schools and child care facilities, upgrade veterans' hospitals and federal buildings, solidify the infrastructure of our care economy, creating jobs and raising wages and basements for essential home care workers, revitalizing manufacturing, securing U.S. supply chains, investing in R&D, and training Americans for the jobs of the future. And for this, $2 trillion over 8 years, 1 percentage point of national income switched to public investment. And the reaction has to be, with that list of goals and that amount of money, just 1% of what the country spends every year, and to do it all over 8 years, that is not nearly enough to attain all of those goals. It will, however, be a start. Turning a supertanker is, after all, a lengthy process. And this infrastructure deficit, this has been built up over 2 generations now. Perhaps the most interesting thing here is the reaction of the Republican Party to Biden's laundry list here. The rising, quote, star, quote, and definitely I insist on the quotation marks, Republican Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota, she whose district has the highest coronavirus death rate of any district in the world, says, I was shocked by how much doesn't go into infrastructure. It goes into research and development. It goes into housing and pipes and different initiatives, green energy, and it's not really an honest conversation we're having about what this proposal is. To which the very sharp Greg Sargent writes in response, quote, the distinction Noem drew between infrastructure on the one hand and research and development and green energy, Republican lawmakers have increasingly equated infrastructure with new highways that connect rural communities and promote exurban sprawl. They see most of what Biden proposed as Democratic infrastructure. In short, an interstate and a bridge is all that Republicans today think when they talk about infrastructure. Now, things used to be very different after the launch of Sputnik, for example. For the Eisenhower administration, for the federal government then to spend whatever it took to produce universities and scientists in high technology became priority number 1 of the Republican Party. Education and engineering high technology became the key pieces of lacking American infrastructure that the Eisenhower administration wanted to create. IT was essential to the Republican vision of how America was to achieve its national purposes. That's from my book, written 5 years ago with Stephen S. Cohen, Concrete Economics, The Hamilton Approach to Economic Policy. It is a plea for pragmatism rather than ideology in political economy, and it is a sotto voce word of advice to Republicans to return their party to what it was before Goldwater cursed them and enslaved them to the demons of racism. Back then, they thought the point was to make the American economy stronger, more dynamic, and more rapidly changing and growing, because we are a frontier people, and today's frontiers are technological. And yes, the Republicans of 50 years ago thought there would be some big winners, but A, that was a point, and B, in the long run, nearly everyone would be a winner. Alas, now, and more with each passing day, at least if you wish to listen to former Republican Speaker of the House John Boehner or listen to the Lincoln Project people, the Republican Party has become a party of plutocrats and white racist adjacents who greatly fear change and dynamism. For the plutocrats, especially the heirs and heiresses, growth, dynamism, and change are their enemies because it is their wealth that dynamic Schumpeterian capitalism may creatively destroy. For the race and adjacents, it's because growth, dynamism, and change bring the possibility that people who look different will not bow heads in the future, but instead will look you in the eye. So, what ought to be a very easy bipartisan lift: restore America's public investment to boost productivity growth and lift all votes. International corporate tax harmonization will be a heavy lift that will have to be accomplished by the Democratic legislative caucuses alone, or in the best case will gain bipartisan support only after Democrats demonstrate that they could do it alone. And so once again, I give it chances of only 50-50. I really wish I were more confident that America is getting back on track than I can convince myself that it is today. This is the DeLongTODAY broadcast briefing. I'm Brad DeLong. Thank you very much for watching.